Mary Poppins Comes Back by P.L. Travers. Chapter 1. The Kite. It was one of those mornings when everything looked very neat and bright and shiny, as though the world had been tidied up overnight. In Cherry Tree Lane the houses blinked as their blinds went up, and the thin shadows of the cherry trees fell in dark stripes across the sunlight. But there was no sound anywhere, except for the tingling of the ice cream man's bell as he wheeled his cart up and down. "Stop me and buy one," said the placard in front of the cart, and presently a sweep came round the corner of the lane and held up his black, sweepy hand. The ice cream man went tingling up to him. "Penny one," said the sweep, as he stood leaning on his bundle of brushes as he licked out in the ice cream with the tip of his tongue. When it was all gone, he gently wrapped the cone in his handkerchief and put it in his pocket. "Don't you eat cones?" said the ice cream man, very surprised. "No, I collect them," said the sweep, and he picked up his brushes and went in through Admiral Boom's front gate because there was no tradesman's entrance. The ice cream man wheeled his cart up the lane again and tingled, and the stripes of shadow and sunlight fell on him as he went. "Never knew it quite so before," he murmured, gazing from right to left and looking out for customers. At that very moment a loud voice sounded from number 17. The ice cream man's cycle hurried up to the gate, hoping for an order. "I won't stand it! I won't stand it! I simply will not stand any more!" shouted Mr. Banks, striding angrily from the front door to the foot of the stairs and back again. "What is it?" said Mrs. Banks, anxiously hurrying out of the dining room. "And what is that you are kicking up and down the hall?" Mr. Banks lunged out with his foot, and something black flew halfway up the stairs. "My hat!" he said between his teeth. "My best bowler hat!" He ran up the stairs and kicked it down again. It spun for a moment on the tiles and fell at Mrs. Banks's feet. "Is anything wrong with it?" said Mrs. Banks nervously, but to herself she wondered whether there was not something wrong with Mr. Banks. "Look and see!" he roared at her. Trembling, Mrs. Banks stooped and picked up the hat. It was covered with large, shiny, sticky patches, and she noticed that it had a peculiar smell. She sniffed at the brim. "It smells like boot polish," she said. "It is boot polish," retorted Mr. Banks. "Robertson A. has brushed my hat with the boot brush. In fact, he has polished it." Mrs. Banks' mouth fell with horror. I don't know what's come over this house," Mr. Banks went on. "Nothing ever goes right, hasn't for ages. Shaving water too hot, breakfast coffee too cold, and now this." He snatched his hat from Mrs. Banks and caught up his bag. "I am going," he said, "and I don't know that I shall ever come back. I shall probably take a long sea voyage." And he clapped the hat on his head, banged the front door behind him, and went through the gate so quickly that he knocked over the ice cream man, who had been listening to the conversation with interest. "It's your own fault," he said crossly. "You'd no right to be there." And he went striding off toward the city, his polished hat shining like a jewel in the sun. The ice cream man got up carefully, and finding there were no bones broken, he sat down on the curb and made it up to himself by eating a large ice cream. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Banks, as she heard the gate slam. "It's quite true. Nothing does go right nowadays. First one thing, then another. Ever since Mary Poppins left without a word of warning, everything has gone wrong." She sat down at the foot of the stairs and took out her handkerchief and cried into it. As she cried, she thought of all that had happened since the day that Mary Poppins had so suddenly and so strangely disappeared. "Here one night and gone the next. Most upsetting," said Mrs. Banks, gulping. Nurse Green had arrived soon after and had left at the end of a week because Michael had spat at her. She was followed by Nurse Brown, who went out for a walk one day and never came back, and it was not until later that they discovered that all the silver spoons had gone with her. After Nurse Brown came Miss Quigley, the governess, who had to be asked to leave because she played scales for 3 hours every morning before breakfast, and Mr. Banks did not care for music. "And then," sobbed Mrs. Banks into her handkerchief, "there was Jane's attack of measles, and the bathroom geyser bursting, and the cherry trees ruined by frost, and—" "If you please, Mrs. Banks looked up to find Mrs. Brill, the cook, at her side. "The kitchen flue's on fire," said Mrs. Brill gloomily. "Oh, dear, what next?" cried Mrs. Banks. "You must tell Robertson A. to put it out. Where is he?" "Asleep, mum, in the broom cupboard." And when that boy's asleep, nothing'll wake him. It's neither an earthquake or a regiment of tom-toms, said Mrs. Brill as she followed Mrs. Banks down the kitchen stairs. Between them they managed to put out the fire, but that was not the end of Mrs. Banks's troubles. She had no sooner finished luncheon than a crash, followed by a loud thud, was heard from upstairs. "What is it now?" Mrs. Banks rushed out to see what had happened. "Oh, my leg! My leg!" cried Ellen, the housemaid. She sat on the stairs, surrounded by broken china, groaning loudly. "What's the matter with it?" said Mrs. Banks sharply. "Broken," said Ellen dismally, leaning against the banisters. "Nonsense, Ellen, you've sprained your ankle, that's all." But Ellen only groaned again. "My leg is broken, what will I do?" she wailed over and over again. At that moment the shrill cries of the twins sounded from the nursery. They were fighting for the possession of a blue celluloid duck. Their screams rose thinly above the voices of Jane and Michael, who were painting pictures on the wall and arguing as to whether a green horse should have a purple or a red tail. And through this uproar there sounded, like a steady beat of a drum, the groans of Ellen, the housemaid. "My leg is broken, what shall I do?" "This," said Mrs. Banks, rushing upstairs, "is the last straw." She helped Ellen to bed and put a cold water bandage round her ankle. Then she went up to the nursery. Jane and Michael rushed at her. "It should have a red tail, shouldn't it?" demanded Michael. "Oh, Mother, don't let him be so stupid. No horse has a red tail, has it?" "Well, what horse has a purple tail? Tell me that." "My duck!" shrieked John, snatching the duck from Barbara. "Mine, mine, mine!" cried Barbara, snatching it back. "Children, children!" Mrs. Banks was wringing her hands in despair. "Be quiet, or I shall go mad!" There was silence for a moment, as they stared at her with interest. Would she really, they wondered? And what would she be like if she did? "Now," said Mrs. Banks, "I will not have this behaviour. Poor Ellen has hurt her ankle, so there is nobody to look after you. You must all go into the park and play there till tea-time. Jane and Michael, you must look after the little ones. John, let Barbara have the duck now, and you can have it when you go to bed. Michael, you may take your new kite. Now get your hats, all of you." "But I want to finish my horse," began Michael crossly. "Why must we go to the park?" complained Jane. "There's nothing to do there." "Because," said Mrs. Banks, "I must have peace, and if you will go quietly and be good children, there will be coconut cakes for tea." And before they had time to break out again, she had put on their hats and was hurrying them down the stairs. "Look both ways," she called, and went through the gate. As they went through the gate, Jane pushing the twins in the perambulator and Michael carrying his kite. They looked to the right. There was nothing coming. They looked to the left. Nobody there but the ice cream man, who was jingling his bell at the end of the lane. Jane hurried across. Michael trailed after her. "I hate this life," he said miserably to his kite. "Everything always goes wrong, always." Jane pushed the perambulator as far as the lake. "Now," she said, "give me the duck." The twins shrieked and clutched at each other. Jane uncurled their fingers. "Look," she said, throwing the duck into the lake. "Look, darlings, it's going to India." The duck drifted off across the water. The twins stared at it and sobbed. Jane ran around the lake and caught it and sent it off again. "Now," she said brightly, "it's off to Southampton." The twins did not appear to be amused. "Now to New York." They wept harder than ever. Jane flung out her hands. "Michael, what are we to do with them? If we give it to them, they'll fight over it, and if we don't, they'll go on crying." "I'll fly the kite for them," said Michael. "Look, children, look." He held up the beautiful green and yellow kite and began to unwind the string. The twins eyed it tearfully and without interest. He lifted the kite above his head and ran a little way. It flapped along the air for a moment, and then collapsed hollowly in the grass. "Try again," said Jane encouragingly. "You hold it up while I run," said Michael. This time the kite rose a little higher, but as it floated, its long tasseled tail caught in the branches of a lime tree, and the kite dangled limply among the leaves. The twins howled lustily. "Oh dear," said Jane, "nothing goes right nowadays." "Hello, hello, hello, what's this?" said a voice behind them. They turned and saw the park keeper, looking very smart in his uniform and peaked cap. He was prodding up stray pieces of paper with the sharp end of his walking stick. Jane pointed to the lime tree. The keeper looked up. His face became very stern. Now, you're breaking the rules. We don't allow litter here, you know. Not on the ground, nor in the trees, neither. This won't do at all." "It isn't litter, it's a kite," said Michael. A mild, soft, foolish look came over the keeper's face. He went up to the lime tree. "A kite! So it is! I haven't flown a kite since I was a boy!" He sprang into the tree and came down holding the kite tenderly under his arm. "Now," he said excitedly, "we'll wind her up and give her a run, and away she'll go." He put out his hand for the winding stick. Michael clutched it firmly. "Thank you, but I want to fly it myself." "Well, but you'll let me help, won't you?" said the keeper humbly, "seeing as how I got it down, and I haven't flown a kite since I was a boy." "All right," said Michael, for he didn't want to seem unkind. "Oh, thank you," cried the keeper gratefully. "Now I take the kite and walk 10 paces down the green, and when I say go, you run, see?" The keeper walked away, counting his steps out loud. 8, 9, 10. He turned and raised the kite above his head. "Go!" Michael began to run. "Let her out!" roared the keeper. Behind him, Michael heard a soft flapping noise. There was a tug at the string as the winding stick turned in his hand. "She's afloat!" cried the keeper. Michael looked back. The kite was sailing through the air, plunging steadily upwards. Higher and higher it dived, a tiny wisp of green and yellow bounding away into the blue. The keeper's eyes were popping. "I never saw such a kite, not even when I was a boy," he murmured, staring upwards. A light cloud came up over the sun and puffed across the sky. "It's coming toward the kite," said Jane in an excited whisper. Up and up went the tossing tail, darting through the air, until it seemed but a faint dark speck on the sky. The cloud moved slowly toward it, nearer, nearer. "Gone," said Michael as the speck disappeared behind the thin gray screen. Jane gave a little sigh. The twins sat quietly in the perambulator. A curious stillness was upon them all. The taut string running up from Michael's hand seemed to link them all to the cloud. From the earth to the sky, they waited, holding their breaths for the kite to appear again. Suddenly, Jane could bear it no longer. "Michael!" she cried. "Pull it in! Pull it in!" She laid her hand upon the tugging, quivering string. Michael turned the stick and gave a long, strong pull. The string remained taut and steady. He pulled again, puffing and panting. "I can't," he said. "It won't come." "I'll help," said Jane. "Now pull." But hard as they tugged, the string would not give, and the kite remained hidden behind the cloud. "Let me," said the keeper importantly. "When I was a boy, we did it this way." He put his hand on the string just above Jane's and gave a short, sharp jerk. It seemed to give a little. "Now all together! Pull!" he yelled. The keeper tossed off his hat, and planting their feet firmly on the grass, Jane and Michael pulled with all their might. "It's coming!" panted Michael. Suddenly the string slackened, and a small whirring shape shot through the gray cloud and came floating down. "Wind her up!" the keeper sputtered, glancing at Michael, but the string was already winding round the stick of its own accord. Down, down came the kite, turning over and over in the air, wildly dancing at the end of the jerking string. Jane gave a little gasp. "Something's happened," she cried. "That's not our kite, it's a different one." They stared. It was quite true. The kite was no longer green and yellow. It had turned color, and was now navy blue. Down it came, tossing and bounding. Suddenly Michael gave a shout. "Jane! Jane, it isn't a kite at all. It looks like... Oh, it looks like..." "Wind, wind, Michael! Wind quickly!" gasped Jane. "I can hardly wait!" For now, above the tallest trees, the shape at the end of the string was very clearly visible. There was no sign of the green and yellow kite, but in its place danced a figure that seemed at once strange and familiar. A figure wearing a blue coat with silver buttons, a straw hat trimmed with daisies. Tucked under its arm was an umbrella with a parrot's head for a handle. A brown carpet bag dangled from one hand, while the other held firmly to the end of the shortening string. "Ah!" Jane gave a shout of triumph. "It is she!" "I knew it!" cried Michael, his hands trembling on the winding stick. "Lummy!" said the park keeper, blinking. "Lummy!" And there we will pause.